My name is Lucas, and the story I'm about to share happened while I was stationed at an Air Force base in Louisiana. Since I arrived at the base in 2006, I had heard strange tales from both fellow servicemen and local residents. The region seemed to carry an eerie atmosphere, as though something disturbingly out of the ordinary lurked just beyond sight. Among the most common stories were those about the Hat Man, a mysterious figure who supposedly appeared on a remote dirt road and then vanished without a trace. Another story spoke of a maniac who had been hit by a car and fled into the nearby forest, disappearing without a trace. But the story that haunted me the most was about a little girl who had died at a construction site in a storage area on the base. Many people claimed to have seen or heard her spirit wandering the area. Over the years, these tales accumulated, leaving a lingering sense of unease that never really faded. The base itself, isolated and distant from the outside world, seemed to carry a heavy, almost oppressive feeling, as if the shadows of those stories still lingered. When I arrived at the base in 2006, I quickly realized that something wasn't quite right. From the very first day, these eerie stories were woven into the fabric of daily life. People spoke of the Hat Man who appeared on the dirt road, only to vanish without a trace. I also heard about the maniac hit by a car who had run into the forest, as if the very forest had consumed him. But the tale that most stuck with me was the one about the little girl. According to locals, she had died at a construction site in the storage area of the base. The story spread quickly, and everyone seemed to have their own version. Some claimed they could hear the sound of her childish laughter on quiet nights, while others spoke of distant, mournful cries that seemed to echo endlessly. At first, I dismissed these as mere urban legends, but over time I realized they were affecting everyone on base. It was as if fear and mystery had taken root there, and no one could escape the feeling that something terrible still lingered. One cold, silent night, my partner and I were assigned to patrol the storage area near the construction site where the little girl had died. From the start, something felt off. The silence was too deep, almost as if even the sound of our own breathing was too much. The dirt road was deserted, but we couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching us from the shadows. As we drove, the darkness seemed to swallow everything around us. There were no stars, just a thick, oppressive fog hanging in the air. It was as though the world itself was retreating, hiding from us. Suddenly, we heard a faint, sorrowful groan. It was weak, like a child's lament. I glanced at my partner and we both froze in terror. The sound seemed to come from both inside and outside the truck, as if we were surrounded by it. It wasn't a natural sound, not something that could be easily explained. It was agonizing, like a child crying out in pain, begging for help. I tried to ignore it, convinced it was just my imagination, but the sound continued, growing louder and closer. My partner and I were paralyzed, unable to move. We didn't know where the sound was coming from, but the feeling of something malevolent, was overwhelming. We knew we had to get out of there. No matter what was happening, we couldn't stay. Whatever that sound was, it haunted us. To this day, I can't forget that moment. When the sound intensified, all I could think about was getting out. My partner and I were frozen in fear, but panic consumed us. The groan was agonizing, coming from both inside and outside the truck at once. The tension was unbearable, as if everything around us was about to collapse. It didn't matter where the sound was coming from, it didn't want to leave us in peace. We sped away as fast as we could, the truck roaring down the winding path, trying to escape the sound. As we drove, the groan faded, growing fainter, but the fear never left us. It was as though something or someone was chasing us, even from a distance. The next morning, we told our commanding officer what had happened, but what he said only made things worse. He told us he had experienced something similar in the very same area years before. Hearing that felt like opening a door to a world I wished I could forget. I knew this wasn't a coincidence, and something much darker was lurking there. Since that day, I've never returned to that storage area. The sound still haunts me, and I know I'll never forget it. Even years after that incident, I still remember the sound vividly. Every time I close my eyes, it echoes in my mind. That agonizing groan, like a child crying in pain. The fear has never truly gone away. Hearing that my commander had experienced something similar only strengthened the feeling that we weren't alone, that something or someone remained in that place. I've never returned to that storage area, and every time I drive past it, an inexplicable unease washes over me. No matter how many years have passed, the fear remains. Whenever I hear stories like this or recall that place, I feel a chill run down my spine. The little girl, or whatever it was, seems to continue haunting that area, even after all this time. Sometimes I find myself trying to piece together what really happened that night. I still don't have answers, only the certainty that something supernatural, something beyond explanation is still there. And as those memories haunt me, I know I'll never look at that place the same way again. The psychological terror I felt has never disappeared, and the idea of confronting the unknown continues to pursue me. I always knew that war brought with it a sense of imminent danger, something beyond our control. But I never imagined the real fear would begin even before we faced the enemy. When I arrived at the base deep in the jungle of the Vietnam War in 1968, the tension was already palpable. The area was isolated, surrounded by dense trees that stretched on endlessly. With each step, there was a feeling that we were being watched, though there was nothing visible to alert us. The sounds of the jungle were the most terrifying. At night, the silence was so thick it became oppressive. But during the day, the cries of birds and the whispering trees created a constant noise that never left us in peace. There was a permanent unease, as if the jungle itself was alive, breathing, waiting for the moment we would become easy prey. It was in that suffocating environment that I realized the true enemy was often not found in physical battles, but in the things that haunted us from within. The fear I felt at that base in the first few days was one of the deepest I've ever experienced. The emptiness of the jungle and the imminent darkness of night left me restless. There was no light at the end of the path, only the oppressive silence surrounding me. The feeling that something could be lurking, waiting in some dark corner, became my worst nightmare. The fear didn't come from direct confrontations, but from the unknown that seemed to inhabit every tree, every shadow. I was already in hostile territory, and it didn't feel like a fight against the enemy, but against something even darker: psychological terror. The first night on patrol, we were deep in the jungle, trying to move quietly. Everything seemed calm, but there was something about the atmosphere that made me uneasy. The heavy air, the sounds of the forest, they never seemed natural. The jungle felt alive, but in a way that seemed to want to swallow everything around us. As we moved through the muddy terrain and the towering trees, each step was silent, but charged with tension. Every shadow seemed larger than it actually was, and the silence of the night was only broken by distant cries of nocturnal animals and whispers of the wind. We couldn't see, but we could feel invisible presences all around us. It was during this patrol that we found the first bodies, 3 Viet Cong soldiers lying in pools of blood as if time had frozen in those final moments. Looking at them was like looking at young men who could have been my friends or brothers. But what struck me most wasn't just the sight of the bodies, but the eerie silence surrounding them. There was no one to mourn for them, no one to bury their remains, only emptiness and that fresh blood marking the ground. Seeing those young men in such a brutal scene made me question everything. What had led them there? What had they done before their deaths? There was a silent pain in their expressions, something that seemed to say they too had been afraid. The fear of being hunted as we were in that jungle. That vision never left my mind. It was like a ghost trapped in the middle of that war, a witness to something I would rather forget. The jungle patrol became a landmark in my mind, but the true terror started when we returned to base. In the first few nights after encountering the bodies, something shifted inside me. I couldn't sleep properly. My head felt heavy, the whispers in the dark. At night, in the absolute silence of the jungle, the sounds seemed amplified. It was as if the forest was watching me, as if all the noises I heard were closing in on me. But the strangest thing was the whispers. I knew they didn't come from the trees or the animals. They weren't just echoes from the jungle. They seemed to come directly from inside my mind, whispering words I couldn't understand. The whispers were unsettling. Sometimes they seemed distant, like an indistinct murmur, almost imperceptible. Other times they felt as if they were right next to me, like someone speaking directly in my ear, but I could never identify what they were saying. The fear took root when I realized the whispers never stopped. They were there, even when I tried to distract myself. As time passed, they became more persistent, more uncomfortable. I couldn't make sense of what was happening. In those dark nights, silence became my greatest enemy. The whispers were like a constant reminder that something was wrong, something beyond what I could see. It felt as if the jungle was pursuing me, even in my own thoughts, whispering secrets I would never understand. That consumed me from within, and the fear was like a sharp blade cutting me at every moment. Something was there, something I couldn't see, but that seemed to be watching me constantly. The nights in the jungle were always the worst. The deep darkness stretched endlessly. But it was on the fourth night that something completely disturbed me. It was as if the jungle had taken on a life of its own. During the patrol, the silence around us seemed heavier, denser. We walked between the trees, each shadow larger than before. I couldn't ignore the feeling that I was being watched. Something was there, hidden in the shadows, waiting. That's when I saw the silhouette of a figure among the trees. At first I thought it was just another hallucination, exhaustion mixed with fear. But this felt different. The figure stood still, motionless, wearing a hat that contrasted with the dark mantle of night. The only thing I could make out were the eyes, empty, cold. The face seemed not to belong to a human, as if it was covered by something that concealed its true identity. Each step we took toward that figure felt like we were slipping further from reality. Fear was turning into panic. When the sun rose, the figure vanished as if it had never been there. But the memory of its dark, empty eyes continued to haunt me. The trees, which had once seemed harmless, now felt as if they carried secrets I couldn't unravel. I felt something, or someone, had been watching me all along. Something that had hidden in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to appear. The jungle, which once seemed like just a hostile environment, now seemed to challenge me, to offer up a mystery I couldn't ignore. After that, the nights became unbearable. Whatever I had seen or felt seemed to have marked me forever. I couldn't sleep, and the silence that had once accompanied me became a deafening scream. The more I tried to ignore it, the more it seemed to grow within me. The jungle wouldn't leave me in peace. Every night the whispers returned, and with them, an oppressive sense that there was something beyond what I could see. It felt as if the forest itself was staring at me, waiting for the right moment to consume me. The memories of the dead soldiers, the dark figures that emerged from the trees. It all seemed to converge into one point: fear that I could no longer control. During one of the final patrols, when I was already at the edge of sanity, I had the feeling that something or someone was approaching. I heard a faint, muffled sound coming from deep within the forest. It seemed like the jungle was breathing, as if a shadowy, oppressive presence was moving through the trees. The air felt heavier, and the weight on my shoulders was almost unbearable. I couldn't tell if it was a supernatural presence or my own fear taking form. When I told my fellow patrol members, they all had similar stories. They too had heard whispers and seen shadows among the trees. The jungle had become much more than just a battleground. It was as if it was challenging me, showing me there was far more than what I could see. Decades later, those memories still haunt me. The jungle still appears in my dreams, and every time I close my eyes, the whispers return. What we lived through was never just a military mission. It was something far deeper and more disturbing. Something I'll never forget. It was the early evening when the orders came through. I had been sent to a remote base, deep in a desolate region with no reliable means of communication. As soon as I arrived, whispers began to circulate about a dark, unpaved road near an abandoned warehouse. Strange stories had been passed down among the veterans and the older personnel at the base. They spoke of a figure, a man in a black hat, who appeared on that road on silent nights. No one knew exactly what he represented, but the mere mention of him sent chills down spines. At first I dismissed it as military superstition, something to scare the new recruits, but the eerie atmosphere of the base began to unsettle me. As the days passed, the silence that surrounded the area felt heavier, as if the night itself was waiting for something. By day, the road seemed harmless enough, but at night, it felt as though the shadows had a life of their own. When the patrol shift was announced, a knot formed in my stomach. It was inevitable, and despite my apprehension, I pressed on. But as I walked the road, an overwhelming sense of dread took hold of me. The rumors no longer seemed distant or fanciful. They were real. The patrol started off normally. At least, I kept telling myself that. My partner and I drove slowly along the dirt road that cut through the barren landscape of the base. The night was dark and quiet, with only the moonlight to guide us. Everything felt unnervingly calm, but the feeling of being watched was impossible to shake. The tension grew thicker, almost as if the silence itself was suffocating. There was no sign of life for miles, just dirt, dust, and the distant hum of the truck's engine. Yet something felt off. In the distance, I noticed a silhouette forming on the road. A human figure, dressed in black, wearing a hat. The same man from the stories. He appeared out of nowhere, standing motionless in the middle of the road as though waiting for us. I tried to convince myself it was an illusion, but the silence and emptiness of that road made it feel like we were trapped in a nightmare. The man remained there, his figure becoming more real with every passing second. When I locked eyes with him, he vanished, as if he had never been there. Fear took root in my chest. The silence was now more oppressive than ever. All I could hear was my pounding heart. After the figure disappeared, my partner and I stood there in complete silence. Neither of us dared speak. The fear was overwhelming, filling every second of that darkness. The truck's engine seemed deafening, yet in contrast to the silence around us, it felt insignificant. The headlights of the truck illuminated the road, but the shadows of the surrounding trees stretched endlessly. I felt as if I were being watched by unseen eyes, something far beyond human comprehension. The presence of the man in the black hat lingered in my mind, a haunting specter etched into the landscape. My partner drove slowly as if searching for something, anything that could explain what we had seen. I continued staring out the window, desperate for a sign, any clue that might make sense of the figure. But the longer I looked, the emptier it all seemed. It was in that anguished silence that I began to realize just how vulnerable we were. There was no sound, save for the wind, and in that deafening quiet, I knew something was terribly wrong. After the incident, I struggled to sleep that night. The image of the man in the black hat haunted my mind. During the patrol, the feeling of being watched never left me. When I returned to the base, my superior called me in for a conversation. I knew this wasn't something that could be dismissed. Without hesitation, I told him everything, from the road to the mysterious man who had disappeared before my eyes. He listened in silence, his expression serious. To my surprise, my superior didn't seem shocked. Instead, he began to recount similar experiences he had endured on those same roads. Stories from other soldiers who had reported seeing the man in the black hat. He said they had tried investigating but never found a clear explanation. It was as if the figure had always been there, lurking, waiting for the right moment to appear. His words filled me with a mix of fear and despair. I knew that despite everything, the man in the black hat remained. After my report, my partner and I never had the courage to return to that road. The feeling of being watched never left us, and every strange noise during patrol made us tremble in fear. Time passed, but that encounter never faded. The image of the man in the black hat remained burned into my memory, more real than anything I had ever seen before. Even now, when I close my eyes, his figure appears, standing silently on the road, a shadow that didn't belong. I'll never know what he wanted or why he was there. That road seemed to have become a portal to something dark and unknown. Though curiosity gnawed at me, fear always held the upper hand. Even today, many years later, I can't escape the silence of the night without being haunted by those memories. The stories I heard still haunt me, and every time I think of that road, I feel as if a part of me remains there. I never returned, and perhaps I never will. The man in the black hat continues to wait, watching for his next victim. And no matter how hard I try to forget, the fear always lingers.